Harney County, Oregon, high desert, sagebrush, wind, and dust that works its way into everything you own. For years, a University of Oregon field school had been digging at a rock shelter known as Rimrock Draw. It was slow, patient work, screening dirt, filling buckets, sifting through soil, the kind of dig where you can spend an entire season moving earth and finding almost nothing worth a photograph. Then they found a scraper, orange agate, roughly the size of a palm, shaped along one edge into a working surface, the kind of tool used to strip a hide or clean meat off a bone. On its own, nothing special. Tools like this turn up across the American West by the thousands. The real problem was where it was found. Sitting above it, sealed across the whole deposit, was a layer of volcanic ash traced back to Mount St. Helens. Not the famous 1980 eruption, but a much older one from the late Pleistocene, laid down somewhere around 15 to 800 years ago. Understand what that means physically, because this single fact is really the whole story. Ash falls once. It comes down from the sky, settles, and gets buried. It does not move backward through time. Anything sitting underneath it was already there before the ash fell. That's not an interpretation. That's just gravity and geology doing the only two things they know how to do. So the tool had to be older than the ash. And that made the tool older than the point in time when humans were supposed to have existed anywhere in the Americas at all. The accepted number for decades was 13,000 years. That was the wall. One migration out of Siberia, moving through a corridor between two ice sheets, arriving around 13,000 years ago and spreading quickly across the continent. Nearly all of North American archaeology was built on top of that single number. Textbooks, museum timelines, dissertation committees, entire careers. And here was a scraper, sitting under an ash layer that fell almost 3,000 years before the first humans were supposedly taking their first steps onto this continent. Patrick O'Grady, the archaeologist leading the excavation, had spent a large chunk of his career at that same rock shelter, doing slow, careful, unglamorous work. Someone made that tool, someone shaped its edge, used it, and eventually set it down in the dirt of what is now eastern Oregon. That person is long gone. The tool stayed behind. And the crew standing over it already understood what the position of that scraper meant, long before any lab results came back. They also understood exactly what would happen once they said it out loud, because they had already watched it happen to other researchers before them. The first thing they did was test the edge. Residue analysis found protein consistent with bison on the working surface. Not decoration, not ceremony, not a nice-looking rock somebody was carrying around. This was a tool used for butchery. Someone killed or scavenged a large animal and used this piece of agate to break it apart. That detail alone puts you right into a scene. Blood, hide, cold air, and an animal that no longer even exists in that landscape. Then came the dating. Fragments of bison tooth enamel recovered from the surrounding deposits were sent off for radiocarbon dating. The results, announced in 2023, came back at roughly 18,250 years. Say that number slowly. 18,250, against a model that insisted on 13,000. That is not a small rounding difference you can quietly fold into the existing story with a footnote. That's roughly 5,000 extra years of human presence, with nowhere obvious to fit. 5,000 years of people living, hunting, moving, and dying on a continent the textbooks claimed was still completely empty. The layering logic here is embarrassingly simple, and that's exactly what makes it so hard to dismiss. The layer above was younger, the layer below was older. The tool sat sealed between them, underneath a sheet of volcanic ash that fell from the sky and covered everything at once. It could not have simply dropped down into that layer at some later point. Now here's what makes this case different from the fringe claims you've probably seen 100 times before. This wasn't one enthusiastic hobbyist with a metal detector and a personal website. This was a university field school with published research, presented at academic conferences, defended in front of colleagues who clearly did not want to hear it. The dating was carried out at standard commercial and academic labs, using conventional methods. The ash layer was identified through its geochemical signature, the same way volcanic ash is always identified. Nothing exotic. Nothing invented. The only unconventional part of the whole process was the answer it produced. And that is exactly the point where a discovery stops being simply a scientific finding and starts becoming a political problem inside an entire academic field. Because a date doesn't just sit there quietly. A date implicitly says something about everyone who published a different number before it. Nobody disputes that the tool itself is real. What people fight about is what it means. Let me be fair here, because if I'm not, the rest of this story falls apart. The criticism aimed at Rimrock Draw isn't unreasonable. It's the standard toolkit scientists reach for, and that toolkit exists for good reasons. Rodents burrow. A ground squirrel digs a tunnel, and an object can fall through generations of those tunnels into a much older layer. Roots push through soil and can drag things downward. Frost can heave objects vertically over time. Water moves everything eventually. And there's an even sharper objection than any of those. The dated material is bison tooth enamel. while the artifact is a stone scraper. Proving that a tool and an animal tooth found in the same general deposit actually represent the exact same moment in time is genuinely difficult. That question of true association is one of the oldest arguments in this entire field, and it has quietly buried more sites than bad dating ever has. Every one of those objections has legitimately sunk a bad site before. They deserve to be raised. They have to be raised. But here's what I want you to really sit with. Those exact same objections, in almost the exact same wording, have been used against nearly every single site in North America that came in older than the accepted wall for 80 straight years. Same script, every time. Rodents. Roots, disturbance, contamination, unproven association. At some point, an explanation that gets applied universally stops functioning like an explanation and starts functioning like a reflex. Notice what that reflex actually does. It never has to prove anything concrete. It only has to raise the possibility of a problem, and the burden of proof immediately swings back onto the excavator, who now has to somehow demonstrate a negative in a deposit that's been sitting underground for 18,000 years. That's not skepticism anymore. That's a rigged scoreboard. And there's a second layer to this that has nothing to do with dirt at all. To accept what Oregon is showing, you first have to accept that the accepted model it contradicts was simply wrong. Not slightly off, but wrong by thousands of years. And wrong in a way that means decades of confident teaching, publishing, and museum labeling was resting on a floor that never actually existed. That's not just a data problem anymore. That's an institutional problem. And institutions don't need to conspire to protect themselves. They just need to keep doing what feels like the responsible thing. So here is the uncomfortable truth about Rimrock Draw. Its real significance isn't that it's shocking. It's that it isn't shocking at all, not really. That scraper under the ash isn't a lone anomaly screaming into an empty room. It's simply the newest name on a very long list of sites the field has spent decades explaining away, one at a time, until the list finally grew too long to keep explaining. To understand why that list exists in the first place, you need to understand where the wall came from. Blackwater Draw, New Mexico, back in the 1930s. Excavators there found distinctive fluted stone points sitting in clear layers beneath already known Folsom points, directly associated with mammoth remains. Clean layers, clear sequence, repeatable results. They named this older tool type Clovis, after the nearby town. And here's what almost nobody mentions when they mock the old Clovis first model. It was a genuine triumph at the time. The 19th and early 20th centuries had been an absolute swamp of dubious early human claims across the Americas. Fabricated finds, misread geology, fossils from one layer wrongly paired with tools from another, all pushed by people chasing a headline. The field had been embarrassed again and again. Blackwater Draw was the first thing that actually held up under scrutiny. It was solid, it was repeatable, and it finally gave American archaeology a reliable anchor point after a century of humiliation. That rigor was earned. It wasn't arrogance, it was scar tissue. But scar tissue hardens over time. Over the following decades, the Clovis Point stopped simply being a type of artifact and quietly turned into a boundary marker in time itself. The oldest thing, the first thing. And once a field agrees on what first means, anything older than that isn't treated as a discovery anymore. It's treated as an error waiting to be identified and corrected. Nobody had to organize this deliberately. That's the part people misunderstand when they reach for the word conspiracy. There was no secret committee, no memo, no hidden archive. There was simply peer review, staffed by people whose entire life's work assumed the wall was real. There were grant panels deciding which projects looked credible. There were dissertation committees deciding which young researchers looked promising and which ones looked reckless. None of those individual people had to act in bad faith. They only had to behave like normal, cautious professionals, defending standards they genuinely believed in. And that is far more effective than any cover-up, because it never looks like one from the inside. You don't need to destroy a discovery outright. You only need to make the person defending it look irresponsible. Just ask James Adovasio, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in southwestern Pennsylvania. Adovasio and his team excavated one of the most carefully documented layered sequences in all of North American archaeology. And from the deepest cultural levels came radiocarbon dates reaching back around 16,000 years, 3,000 years past the accepted wall. The response wasn't a shrug. The response was decades of sustained, focused attack centered on one specific argument. There is coal in that region, and ancient carbon could have leached into the samples, artificially inflating the dates. It was a legitimate chemical concern. It deserved investigation. It got that investigation. Adovasio and his colleagues addressed it directly, tested for it, published their findings, and kept publishing on it for most of his career. Think about what that actually costs a person. Not a scandal, not a firing. Something. They looked at the evidence, and they conceded. I want to be careful here, because it would be cheap and unfair to paint Haynes as some kind of villain. He wasn't. He was a serious scientist applying serious standards, and those standards genuinely protected the field from a lot of bad claims over the years. But when one person's personal standard becomes the single gate everything must pass through, delay stops being caution and quietly turns into doctrine. Adavasio and Dillehay weren't really arguing over a date. They were arguing against the entire shape of a discipline. The concession eventually arrived. The apology never did. And the years those two men spent absorbing the damage were never given back to them. Now head north, because the doorway into the Americas is absolutely real, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Swan Point in the Tanana Valley of interior Alaska. The deepest cultural layer at that site, Cultural Zone 4, dates to roughly 1,450 years old. It's the oldest firmly accepted human occupation anywhere in Alaska, and almost nobody in the field disputes it. What makes Swan Point important isn't just its age. It's what actually came out of the ground. Microblades. Tiny, razor-thin slivers of stone struck off prepared cores, using a technique that takes real skill to learn and real skill to pass on. You don't stumble into microblade production by accident. You inherit it as a tradition. These slivers were designed to be slotted into carved grooves along bone or antler shafts, glued into a row to create one long composite cutting edge. Break one piece, simply replace it. It's modular tool engineering carried by people who belong to an established tradition, and that tradition wasn't local. It's the exact same technological signature found in the late Pleistocene of Siberia, in what archaeologists call the Dyuktai complex. So the Siberian connection here isn't in doubt at all. It's stone cold documented. The doorway was real. People genuinely came through it, and the toolkit they carried can be traced across the Bering Land Bridge almost like a signature on a receipt. Here's where it stops being comfortable, though. If the earliest firm evidence in Alaska sits around 14,150 years, how do you explain someone scraping a bison hide in Oregon at 18,250 years? And how do you explain a village in Chile at roughly 14,500 years? Essentially the same moment as the Alaskan site, but on the opposite side of two continents, separated by 10,000 kilometers of ice, mountains, rivers, and forest. You cannot physically walk that fast. Nobody can walk that fast. Genetics offered a way out, and that way out is called the Beringian standstill. The idea is that a population left Siberia and then sat isolated on the Bering Land Bridge itself, cut off from Asia behind them and blocked by ice ahead of them for thousands of years, slowly drifting genetically and becoming a distinct population. It's an elegant idea, and it's genuinely well supported. People often talk about it as though it rescued the old migration model. It didn't rescue anything. It was really the old model quietly admitting that human beings were already out there in the north, waiting thousands of years before Clovis ever existed. The wall didn't hold. It just got moved somewhere a little less embarrassing. Then a child's grave in interior Alaska pulled the entire argument out of pure theory. Archaeologists excavating a residential site found a burial pit beneath an old hearth, containing the remains of infants laid to rest with red ochre and grave goods, dated to around 11,500 years ago. This isn't just a data point. This is a funeral. People living in a brutal climate stopped what they were doing, dug into the ground of their own living space, and buried children with ochre and offerings. That is grief, physically preserved in sediment. In 2018, researchers published the genome of one of those infants, and the result didn't fit anyone's tidy diagram. She belonged to a population that had split away from the ancestors of other Native Americans roughly 20,000 years ago. That population then remained separate, and then it simply ended. Researchers named this group the Ancient Beringians. Read that again, because the implication is genuinely striking. She isn't an ancestor of living Native Americans today. She's more like a distant cousin from a branch of the family tree that eventually terminated. A whole population, with its own history we will never fully recover, that existed and then stopped existing. Now hold that number up against everything else. 20,000 years ago, according to DNA extracted from a real child in a real grave, the founding population was already splitting into separate branches. That kind of split doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because human beings were already living in the north, already isolated, already dividing into distinct groups, which means the genetic evidence had effectively killed the single-wave migration story before the archaeological community was even willing to admit it. The DNA said the branching had already begun by 20,000 years ago. Oregon said someone was butchering bison at 18,250 years ago. And for the first time, those two numbers stopped contradicting each other and started agreeing. Then, in 2023, the source population itself got more complicated. A research team publishing in Cell reports traced one specific maternal lineage, mitochondrial haplogroup D4, including the D4H3A branch that shows up along the Pacific coast of the Americas, and followed it backward in time. It didn't lead back to interior Siberia. It pointed instead toward northern coastal China. The study proposed two separate migration waves out of that region, one during the coldest depths of the last glacial maximum, and a later one near the end of the Pleistocene. A related branch of that same lineage also shows up in Japan. It is not the entire ancestry of a population. The mainstream position still holds that the ancestral Native American population formed somewhere in Northeast Asia and Siberia, and this particular study doesn't overturn that. Fine. But look closely at the direction of travel it suggests. A coastal maritime route following a shoreline, not a route grinding through a frozen interior corridor. The source wasn't just one single point. The route wasn't just one single line. The real story was never just one wave of one people walking one single path. And the map printed in every textbook for 50 years had exactly one arrow drawn on it. Which brings us to the claim most archaeologists want absolutely nothing to do with. San Diego, 1992. A highway expansion project. Heavy machinery cutting through old sediment layers. A paleontologist named Richard Cerruti, monitoring the construction work, spotted bone exposed in the cut face. Mastodon bone. And what came out of that deposit was strange. Limb bones broken with spiral fracture patterns, the kind that typically happen when bone is still fresh, not fossilized. Heavy cobbles found scattered among the fragments interpreted by the excavators as hammerstones and anvils, showing damage patterns consistent with deliberate impact. Bone fragments that appeared to refit together as though something had been struck and shattered right there in place. The site sat in storage for decades. Then dating technology improved. In 2017, a team including Stephen Holen and Thomas Demeray published in the journal Nature. Uranium-thorium dating of the bone returned an age of roughly 130,000 years. Let me be completely direct with you here. Most archaeologists reject this finding, and not politely. The objections are serious ones. Construction equipment can shatter bone and produce fracture patterns that closely mimic deliberate percussion. And there are no stone tools at the site in the conventionally accepted sense. No worked flakes, no clearly shaped edges, nothing unambiguously manufactured. There are no human or hominin remains at all, and the proposed date sits an entire order of magnitude beyond any secure evidence for people anywhere in the Americas. If this interpretation turned out to be correct, it wouldn't just gently bend the accepted story of human origins in the Americas. It would snap it in half, which is exactly why the pushback against it has been so total and complete. Every textbook map showed it. That narrow green channel opening up between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets as they pulled apart, forming a hallway through the ice from Beringia straight into the heart of the continent. In 2016, researchers pulled sediment cores from lakes along that corridor route and analyzed them for ancient DNA, pollen, and radiocarbon dating. They weren't even looking for people directly. They were looking for something more basic, food. Because a corridor of bare, scoured rock and meltwater isn't really a migration route at all, it's 1,500 kilometers of starvation. You need plants. You need grazing animals. You need a functioning ecosystem before you can realistically walk a family through it. The answer that came back placed the corridor's biological viability at around 12,600 years ago. Read that carefully, because it's one of the great quiet reversals in modern archaeology. The corridor opened up too late to have delivered the people who were already living south of it. Monteverde is older. Meadowcroft is older. Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, excavated by Lauren Davis, is older. Oregon is far older still. The hallway was never actually the way in. Back in 1979, an archaeologist named Knut Fladmark had argued for a Pacific coastal route instead. Boats, shorelines, marine resources. At the time, the field mostly sidelined the idea as pure speculation. Decades later, John Erlandson and his colleagues gave it a proper name and a working mechanism, the Kelp Highway. A nearly continuous belt of kelp forest running from Japan, up and around the North Pacific Rim, and down along the coast of the Americas, packed with fish, shellfish, seals, and sea otters. One consistent ecosystem, one transferable skill set, and no ice to cross it all. So why is there so little physical evidence for it? Because the Pleistocene shoreline those people actually walked along now sits under more than 100 meters of ocean water. The evidence isn't missing, it's drowned. For decades, the absence of early coastal sites was treated as proof that no coastal migration had ever happened. In reality, it was simply proof of how much sea levels have risen. And once you allow boats into this picture at all, a lot of assumptions about ancient people stop feeling safe. Go back to Monteverde for a moment, because it actually supports this directly. That site sits inland, but among its preserved remains are seaweeds and marine species, some of them used medicinally. Those people were clearly connected to the Pacific coast. They knew it. They used it. Then there's a site almost nobody in American archaeology likes to bring up, because it sits on the opposite side of the world and quietly undercuts the exact same assumption. Researchers surveying the Soa Basin on the island of Flores' southern coast reported finding quartz hand axes and other early stone tools, and argued on geological grounds, for ages far beyond anything conventionally accepted for early seafaring. Here's what makes Flores genuinely different from an ordinary early site. It has been an island for millions of years. There is no land bridge. There has never been a land bridge. Whoever left those tools behind had to cross open water to get there in the first place. Now, the honest framing? The floor's dating remains genuinely debated, and the age estimates rest more on geological and geomorphological arguments than on direct dating of the artifacts themselves. Take it as a serious argument, not a settled verdict. But the underlying pattern behind it isn't really debatable, and that's the real point. Over and over again, in region after region, evidence for water crossings keeps turning up earlier than expected. And over again, it meets resistance, because the old idea that early people simply couldn't have sailed was never actually a scientific finding. It was an assumption dressed up as caution, and it was doing an enormous amount of quiet work inside the old migration model. Somebody loaded a boat. Somebody pushed off from a beach they could still see behind them and pointed toward a horizon they couldn't. Take away the ice-free corridor, add watercraft, add a coastline full of food that's now sitting underwater, and a scraper in Oregon dated to 18,000 years stops looking impossible. It starts looking almost late, which brings us to the man the field spent 40 years being wrong about. Bluefish Caves in the northern Yukon, 3 small caves in the Gila Range. Jacques Cinq-Mars excavated there from 1977 to 1987 and reported something that simply could not be allowed to be true. Mammal bones bearing cut marks, found in deposits, dated far beyond the wall. What happened to him afterward wasn't a clean reputational hit. It was slower than that. It was erosion, sustained skepticism. Questions that never got fully resolved because they were never really designed to be resolved. Support for his work gradually thinned out. The site slowly stopped being discussed as a genuine data set and started being invoked instead as a cautionary tale. The example you point to when warning graduate students what happens if you get too far ahead of the evidence. He carried that reputation for the rest of his career. Then, in 2017, a new generation of researchers pulled the original collection back out of storage. Lauriane Bourgeon, Ariane Burke, and Thomas Hyam examined the bone assemblage under high magnification, carefully separating the marks left by carnivore teeth from the marks a stone tool leaves when someone is cutting flesh away from bone. Then they redated the specimens. The human-modified bone was confirmed as genuine. The oldest samples came in at around 24,000 years old. He had been right all along. Notice what that vindication does to the rest of the story. 24,000 years in the Yukon is exactly what the Beringian standstill genetics had already predicted. The DNA said people were already up there, isolated before 20,000 years ago. Cinq-Mars had physical evidence of exactly that, sitting in hand, back in the 1970s, and the field spent decades treating it as a problem to be managed rather than a discovery to be embraced. Here is what I want you to understand, and it's really the emotional core of this whole story. The cruelty wasn't that people questioned him, they had to question him. That's the job, and honestly, it's a good job to have. The cruelty was in how efficiently the man himself became the problem instead of his data. His vindication finally arrived 40 years after his trowel first went into the ground. There was no ceremony, no formal reckoning, no public accounting for those lost decades. The field simply moved on, as if it had always been otherwise. And then the argument stopped being purely about molecules and soil layers and turned into something anyone can look at and immediately understand. White sands, New Mexico, the Tularosa Basin. What is now a gypsum desert was once the shoreline of an ancient lake. And in the soft mud along that old shoreline, people walked. Footprints, hundreds of them, sealed under layers of gypsum, preserved in the exact shape of the moment they were made. In 2021, researchers dated seeds of an aquatic plant, Rupia, found in the layers directly above and below the footprints, and got results between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. The counterattack came fast, and it was reasonable. Aquatic plants can absorb dissolved carbon from old groundwater, which can make radiocarbon dates come out artificially old. It's called the hard water reservoir effect, and it's a genuine, well-known problem. So the team tested it again in 2023. This time, they came back with independent confirmation. Radiocarbon dating on terrestrial conifer pollen, which absorbs its carbon straight from the air rather than water, plus optically stimulated luminescence testing on quartz grains, a method that measures when sediment was last exposed to sunlight and doesn't involve carbon dating at all. Same time window. They tested it using one method and got an answer. They tested it using a completely different branch of physics and got the same answer again. And look closely at what those footprints actually show us. One sequence records a person carrying a small child, setting them down, and then picking them back up again, walking across the same surface as mammoth and giant ground sloth tracks. That isn't just a specimen sitting in a lab drawer. That's an afternoon in someone's life. The footprint outlasted the person who made it by 23,000 years. Now I'll go back to Oregon and look at that scraper again. 8,250 years, sealed under volcanic ash in the high desert. Just a few years ago, that number stood alone as an outlier waiting to be explained away. Today, it sits quietly between Bluefish Caves at 24,000 years and White Sands at 23,000 years, and it starts to look almost ordinary. That's what actually changed. Not one single site, the whole neighborhood around it. So what happened to the old model in the end? There was no press conference, no formal retraction, no accounting for 80 years of dismissals, or for the people who quietly absorbed the cost of them. Museum labels got a little softer. Textbook sentences started picking up words like at least and may have. Papers began writing long assumed, where they used to confidently write established. Migration maps grew a second arrow, drawn along the coastline, usually in a lighter color than the first. The wall didn't collapse dramatically. It got quietly renovated overnight, and everyone simply showed up the next morning, acting as though it had always looked that way. And the real question here is still nowhere near settled. It's wide open. If people were genuinely standing on that lake shore 23,000 years ago, then where is everything else they must have made? The hearths, the campsites, the tools, the graves, the ordinary everyday debris of thousands of years of human life. Some of it is sitting under 100 meters of Pacific Ocean water along a shoreline that drowned once the ice finally melted. Some of it is probably in a museum drawer right now, mislabeled, waiting for someone to finally open it and look again. And some of it is still in the ground in Oregon, sitting beneath a gray band of ash that fell out of the sky, settled, and quietly kept an honest record of exactly what was already underneath it. The ash never had an opinion. The people reading it did.